So hello everyone and welcome along to a rather special edition of Susty Talk, Edie's ongoing series of video interviews put together to keep our audience of sustainability and energy professionals talking, feeling connected and optimistic through this period of lockdown here in the UK and beyond. I'm Edie's content editor, Matt Mace, and joining me for, as I mentioned, this special episode, we have John Elkington, founder and chief pollinator of Volans, and a man who has been a real trailblazer in the corporate sustainability movement. John is an author of 20 books now, I believe. He helped coin the triple bottom line concept of people, planet, profit that a lot of our audience and a lot of businesses have kind of based their sustainability strategies on, and obviously laid the foundations for sustainable business as a strategy, really. John's most recent book, Green Swans, The Coming Boom in Regenerative Capitalism, outlines changing paradigms, values, mindsets, politics, policies, technologies, and other key factors are going to deliver real key market shifts. Obviously, it's a very prominent time to be able to discuss those shifts in particular in this current climate. So, John, a pleasure to be able to speak to you again. Whereabouts are you connecting from?
Matt, it's a pleasure to see you again, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'm in southwest London, in Barnes, which is where my home is, and where I've been pretty much since lockdown started. Although every so often venturing out to see people or having people in socially distanced ways. So, but actually, so far making moderate sense of it all. And what about you?
Yeah, similar. So I'm based down in Hayward Heath, so kind of between Brighton and London, a commuter town. Two bedroom flat, so no garden, windows that only open about that far. So it's been not great in the summer months, but I'm about to move into a house shortly, so I'm going to appreciate the natural outdoors much more when that happens. So it's good in a sense. And John, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to talk to me. Today, we're going to focus on the green recovery in particular and the role of businesses in that. But I think a good place to start actually would be the kind of tagline of your latest book, the coming boom in regenerative capitalism. I suppose a good place to start is one, what do you mean by regenerative capitalism? And in terms of the coming boom or booms, I suppose, how does that tie into the green recovery and the real kind of change in I suppose, business purpose and strategy we've seen since?
No, it's a big question. I'll do my best. And in terms of the coming boom and the recovery, if we get it, yes, they're very tightly aligned, with one difference, which is in the book, the first diagram shows something I call the U-bend. And basically, I've been saying this for 2.5, 3 years now, that I felt we were moving towards some sort of economic discontinuity, all sorts of reasons for that, macroeconomic, geopolitical, technological, and so on. I didn't predict that it would be a pandemic that would do it. And, you know, I am acutely aware that people have suffered a great deal during this period. My sense is, though, that that's not going to end anytime soon. And that's not simply because COVID-19 isn't going to disappear over the horizon and leave us to our own devices. It's because that U-bend, if I'm anywhere near right, will not be dealt with a sort of V-shaped or a U-shaped or a W-shaped recovery or whatever. It's something that we're now stuck with for probably a decade or 10, 15 years. And every so often our economies do this. They go through a disassembly period, and then, you know, a new order starts to self-assemble, very often not where the old economy was most obvious. And I think we're seeing the shift in economic activity towards Asia at the moment. Just finally, to your question around regeneration, some of your viewers and listeners will know that a couple of years ago, through the Harvard Business Review, I recalled the triple bottom line, which you kindly mentioned. This was a product recall. HBR said it was the first time that had ever been attempted with a management concept. The reason I did it was not because I think the triple bottom line is idiotic or a bad idea or not actually helpful. I think it's quite helpful for a lot of people who are running B corporations or doing sustainability reporting, whatever it might be. But I felt it wasn't being understood in a way that would help people use it to address systemic challenges. And where we are now, I think, is people are suddenly realizing that so many of the challenges that we now face collectively are systemic. Plastics in the ocean, obesity, chronic disease, diabetes, space debris, the climate emergency. All of these things are incredibly ferociously interconnected, and COVID-19 has been a very, very good demonstration of that. So in the book, I'm talking not about just responsibility, which is where a lot of the CSR effort is focused, but on resilience. And the best way of getting resilient systems is to regenerate them over time, economic, social, and environmental, and crucially political.
No, that's a really good point. And the resilience point is something that's quite of interest for me in the writing I've done. And the sustainability professional I spoke to, you mentioned the purpose aspect of it tend to sat in kind of CSR. Resiliency I always associate with more of a boardroom level aspect. So is this a sign where more businesses will start to pivot their long-term sustainability, CSR, resilient strategies, however we want to kind of coin that? Is that going to now sit in the boardroom much more than it has done previously?
I think it will in successful companies. It won't as a matter of routine, and I think quite a number of companies are going into denial at the moment. So in today's news, we saw BP saying it's going to spend 5 billion whatevers pounds by 2030 on green and renewable energy and so on. And that's immensely exciting. But you can just bet your bottom dollar that other, and particularly US fossil fuels companies, will be hunkering down and thinking, that's fine for those Europeans to do, but people are going to continue to buy fossil fuels. So I think we're in a very disconcerting period for people at the top of major companies, because suddenly it's no longer about making a business case for doing the right thing. Their very business models are under challenge. And you think about automotive companies who are suddenly seeing electric vehicle companies like Tesla beginning to run rings around them. And then, VW and all sorts of other big players now coming to that. I saw the other day something like 500 electric vehicle models now in prospect by 2023. That's a huge shift in the market, and it's happening in many other areas. So to your question, I think sustainability has been seen as a nice to have. It's been seen as somewhat peripheral. It's been around transparency and accountability and reporting and stakeholder engagement and a bit of supply chain management stuff. And now it's actually about the business. What business are you in? And it's not just about purpose. It's about how do you create value and for whom.
No, that's a very good point there. And in terms, I suppose I'm switching more to a policy level so far.
Yeah.
We've seen some big announcements from the EU that kind of have this kind of dedicated green recovery package with 30% of their spending ring fenced on climate and digital transitions. The UK, not so much a green package, but economic summer update, which was a jobs recovery with some green elements sprinkled on top. In your opinion, how has the response been in terms of governments angling funds towards the right areas and ensuring that we don't really repeat the same mistakes of the 08-09 financial crash, where fossil fuel industries are kind of propped up, and this is a chance to change how things are done?
I think whether or not people decide to change is now inevitable. And the way with 2007-09, we delayed a set of systemic changes that many people knew needed to be done, but they just preferred to sort of throw up flying buttresses to the system as it was. Now we don't, I think, have that choice. And because societies are now paying or spending so much of their treasure on recoveries, they'd be insane. They'd be in complete dereliction of duty if they did not think about the conditions, the broader conditions that they should apply that will sort of help advance other policy objectives. And I think the UK is in some ways doing moderately well on that, but actually in other ways it's lagging behind. And I think the whole sort of green recovery discussion, if you look at the United States, it was originally advanced by people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who, for many Americans looks fairly left-wing. I think she's, a coming thing. I think she's an extraordinary political leader, but people were able to dismiss that as, you know, sort of a bit left field. With the European Union talking about whatever it is, 1.82 trillion, I'm always suspicious of EU big number projects, but nonetheless, a lot of money is going to go into this space. And when we're working with construction and infrastructure companies, for example, they're seeing this as a major shift in their markets for the future, and they're seeing the likelihood as being that a very different set of policy objectives and priorities will start to come in. Now, how that'll play through, and, you know, country by country and market by market, is more or less anyone's guess. And if we were, for whatever reason, suddenly to do that V-shaped escape from all of this, then some of the pressure, I think, would fall away. If, on the other hand, this crisis goes so deep in Europe, you get something like a depression, you'll also lose traction. So we're having to sort of live in hope that the pressure will be sustained for a reasonably protracted timescale, that governments will show an imagination, which, you know, sometimes they slightly lack, but they've had when they've got into sort of information technology or biotechnology or space technology or whatever. Now here we are again, but we've got to this time combine the environmental upsides with some of the social downsides. How do we secure meaningful, long-term, well-paid jobs and employment as we do all of this sort of stuff? So it's a multifactorial equation that I think governments are going to face, and we must wish them well, because if they screw up on this, we all suffer.
And it sounds like, and this is probably applicable to business leaders as well, it's that common debate of short-termism versus long-termism, in terms of the short term is very much just keeping the economy and businesses afloat, whereas long-term it is, you know, what you just mentioned, the societal and environmental aspects. Long-term is not as long-term as it was when people were probably talking about this 10 years ago. You know, 10 years till the SDGs, we've got 10 years to really kind of limit carbon emissions to put the world on for net zero by 2050. So how do you recommend that businesses who are still grappling with short-term financials with long-term sustainability strategies, what advice do you have to them in this?
Well, it's challenging, because one piece of advice is something that they can't do very much about, and that would be, don't be an incumbent. So, you know, many companies that are incumbents and have built very successful market positionings and business models around that and brand propositions and so on are going to find themselves sorely disrupted in what's coming. So even if you are an incumbent, then try to think about an insurgent might. And I think one of the things we've seen in recent years is a growing appetite in some of the rather more traditionally positioned companies to go and see the people who are in the process of disrupting their market. So once you would have gone out and talked to, or had Oxfam or Greenpeace or whatever come in and talk to your top team or whatever, now people are doing sort of study tours and learning journeys and going out to see people like Tesla and, you know, some of these real disruptors, to get a sense of where this might take us all over time. So I think it's a good time to be an insurgent. I think the likelihood that we will see a cascade of new business formations, brand propositions that we've never previously heard of, and entrepreneurs, innovators and entrepreneurs and investors, again, who are a new generation of people who, again, are not particularly well known. I think the next sort of 10 to 15 years will be incredibly exciting, as long as you've got a bit of distance. And to your point about long-term thinking, very few incumbent companies, unless they're sort of doing things like fossil fuels, refineries or mines or whatever, or you know, building infrastructure projects, then people have, or chemical plants, then they have to think, you know, 20, 30, 40 years into the future. But for the most part, the bigger companies, their time horizons, exactly as you say, have been shrinking and shrinking very conspicuously. So again, final point, a view or recommendation, piece of advice, whatever, would be for God's sake, talk to your younger people, because this is their future. They are likely to have a significantly longer time horizon than people who are, in their sort of late 50s to early 70s, who are up on the board level and in the C-suite level. So we've all got to get out more. We've got to talk to people who are actually going to be quite uncomfortable, because they'll tell us things that we don't want to hear. But that's where the best advice typically comes from.
And we've also heard that there's this necessity to not go back to business as usual. Business as usual was inherently broken for the needs of the world and society. Both. Are there any kind of particular aspects of business that you think just won't survive in this kind of post-COVID, whenever we reach that green recovery world?
I don't rule out the possibility that some of the incumbents, some of the lame duck industries could reinvent themselves, and every so often you will find that happening. So, in a previous round of disruption, you had the Apples and later on the Googles and so on disrupting the then incumbent companies like IBM. But IBM reinvented itself over time, became more of a software company. So I think very obviously anything that is highly dependent on energy, particularly fossil fuels, is very likely to go. But there's a spectrum. So anyone who is thinking about the internal combustion engine, so for example, Germany and its wonderfully finely tuned engineering ecosystem is under massive threat now, because electric vehicles, as you know, can be put together rather more simply, rather more cheaply. They need a lot less maintenance over time, and they're on a ferocious cost reduction curve. But then you look at industries like cattle ranching and dairying and so on, and you look at younger people now and the spread of vegan and vegetarian diets. That is a small indication of where we might go over time. But I think much more significant is the emergence of new technologies, synthetic meat, synthetic chickens, synthetic fish, and so on. And at the moment, the early applications will go into things where you can't really see what you're eating, so curries or burgers or whatever. But longer term, again, the technology will evolve very, very profoundly. So I think it's hard to think of a single sector that won't be disrupted. You think of finance, you think of education, you think of so many different. You look at the airlines above our heads. At the moment, I mentioned I'm in southwest London. It's been a joy in some ways not to have the constant aircraft overhead. They're coming back, but just again, yesterday, Virgin Atlantic announcing it's going into bankruptcy. It may come out of it. I'm sure Richard Branson hopes that. But this is such a moment of shake-up. The seismic forces at work now, I don't think will play through anytime soon. So anyone who's thinking about going back to business as usual ought to just think twice before they assume that the world is going to go back to the way that they got used to having it operate.
No, that's a very good message to send businesses, John. And in terms of, I mean, there's been lots of articles and debates kind of highlighting the similarities between the disruption that's been caused by this pandemic and the potential disruptions that will be caused over the coming years through the climate crisis. And we've seen, global carbon emissions are expected to fall this year by, largest ever recorded, 8%, I believe. That's what's required pretty much annually up until now in 2030 to actually reach net zero. And obviously you can't do that this way. So it's not just disruptions from the physical threats of climate change and the impact that will have on the planet, on society, and on business operations, but the actual disruptions required to transition to a green recovery as well. What are the lessons that we need to learn from this and businesses need to take away?
Well, I think one of the lessons is that everything is increasingly interconnected in ways that are very hard for us to see. So if you think about the pandemic, wildlife trafficking in Africa, people digging out bat guano from caves in China, wet markets in Wuhan, coupled with subway systems and international air travel and so on, you could hardly design a better incubator for pandemics. And people have been warning about this for a very long time. We've had SARS and MERS and various other pandemics that have hit us. Now the question is, now that we've seen this is actually almost a matter of routine, this one has hit us harder than and faster than most others. What are we going to do about that? And that I think will be a model for some other very complex systemic crises that we're facing. So I mentioned sort of plastics in the ocean, antibiotic resistance, obesity, chronic disease, diabetes, all of these different things that are, they're not problems where you can just press one button and everything is resolved overnight. They're all multifactorial. They need people to work together in intelligent and sustained ways over time. So I think there's a wonderful cartoon. Most of your listeners or viewers will have seen it, but it shows the current world with the COVID-19 crisis crashing in as a wave, but behind it, stacking up, is the climate emergency, and behind that, even bigger, is the biodiversity emergency. And I think that's very accurate. But the problem is each of these is staggeringly more complicated than the one before. So will we learn, and will we learn in time, and will the right people learn? We can't count on it, and therefore we've all got to step up. We've all got to continuously educate ourselves and ensure that, and not take it for granted that other people will do likewise, because we're a lazy species very often. We just sort of like to go back to sleep, and again, as we said, expect things to go back to normal. This is a new abnormal, as some people say, and it's not going to go away. So our patterns of global governance, our patterns of national government, the way in which business leaders think, the way in which financial markets incentivize and reward different forms of performance, all that has to change. And the unfortunate thing is, the longer we leave it, the harder it's going to be, the riskier it's going to be in the sense of actually getting the results that we really want, and the more expensive it's going to be. So the sooner we get started, the better.
No, definitely agree. And just finally, John, I think lockdown, all the kind of tragedy that's been caused by the pandemic is kind of weighed on a lot of people's mental health. So I think it's great to finish this on a bit of optimism if we can, and kind of outline your one key reason why businesses or sustainability professionals should be optimistic about this upcoming challenge.
Well, I'm not going to say like a preacher, you should be, anyone should be optimistic, but it actually happens to be a fact. And I've just come off a call with a major investment firm, and I said something I really feel, which is I feel more optimistic despite the tragedies and just despite the coming socioeconomic and political impacts of all of this. I feel optimistic because for the first time, people are starting to wake up to the fact not only that this is a complex world, and not only that there are challenges, but that there are pathways through that. And interestingly, some of the pathways converge so that you can do several things at once, as in green deals, green recovery plans, and so on. But that will require different types of leadership. It will require people who think about the world and the future in very different ways. And I think the unfortunate fact, and this is, I'll come back to the optimism, the unfortunate fact is many people who run the biggest companies and so on, and I put aside people like Bernard Looney, who's just announced his plans for BP. Wow, who would have seen that coming? But we're going to have a shakeout in the senior levels of business and in government, because these people, much as we love them, are not fit for purpose in what comes next. I don't mean that Greta Thunberg's going to have to take over every board in the world, not remotely, but younger people are going to be needed in a way that I suspect would have been, again, very hard to predict. I'm hugely optimistic because I think as a species, we tend to wait until we backed ourselves into a corner before we do the really structural important work. And here we are, we're in the mother of all corners. So that's why I'm optimistic. I'm not telling everyone else to share that optimism, but I'd be surprised if the younger people over time don't come to do so as well.
Great to hear, John. Thank you so much for being a guest on this series. I think I've probably kept you for long enough, but I know our audience will really greatly appreciate your insight. So I think that this actually kicks off a lot of green recovery content that we'll be running on Edie over the coming months. So we've got a new business guide launching on the green recovery. There'll be a link for people that want to access that in the article hosting this video. It outlines pretty much what the green recovery entails, the impacts and the opportunities. So the optimism there as well that they can bring to businesses. We'll be launching a series of manifesto blueprints and sectoral guides and on the green recovery and how that will impact certain businesses as well, and so that they can transform to become more resilient, improve against their current and hopefully new sustainability strategies, and ignite a wider green recovery and net zero transformation. So do be on the lookout for them. So John, thank you again so much for your time.
Thank you, Matt, and I shall be passionately engaged with all of this content as it sluices out. Well done, and I look forward to it.
Thank you. And to everyone watching, see you all again soon for our next episode of Susty Talk. And in the meantime, stay safe, stay positive, and keep up the Susty Talk.